Great. Thank you, CEPR and STEG, and thanks everyone for joining this breakout room. I'm excited to present my paper, Courts Redux, Microevidence from India. So judiciary is an important institution for the economy, particularly the role it plays in enforcing contracts and property rights. And often thought of the mechanism as that, hey, judiciary is important for trust, and which is important for contracts, and this lowers uncertainty in transaction costs. And this is important for the development of financial sector and therefore access to credit and so on. And often underlooked channel is also liquidity effect, right? Because if you think about litigation and conflict, there's a lot of productive resources stuck under these litigations. So one of the ways that an effective judiciary works is also it frees up these resources for better productive use, right? So there's a liquidity effect of well-functioning court. And this paper tries to highlight this particular channel by using disaggregated litigation level data from the district courts in India, which are the lowest level of courts, and exploiting exogenous variation in the creation and resolution of judge shortages, in these courts over time, arising from a policy of frequent judge rotation, which leads to sharp changes in the staffing levels around the timing of these locations in the courts. And of course, these are important for the way courts function and, in resolving litigation, but also like from an economic standpoint of view, I find that, when there is a positive shock, there's a better recirculation of cheaper credit, which is important for firms and particularly for smaller firms who are credit constrained, who now have better access to credit. So firm profits, as a result, goes up by over 40%, mainly through like expansion in operating expenditure, which is like wage bill, which increases significantly by 5%. And this, because the firms that I study are formal sector firms and they're tax paying both on corporate profit as well as, the salaried labor force pays income tax on their wages. So the return on any public expenditure in like improving the judiciary or staffing in judiciary generates more than 5 times the return. So the key, I talked about the identification strategy. The way I implement it is, stacked event study design around the timing of these rotations. So here in this chart, I'm focusing on net positive, like courts that receive like net positive shock. And as you see, there's a sharp discontinuity in the number of judges. So on average, of course, these are smaller courts. On average, they have about, let's say, 15 judges. And so, when there is a rotation, there's like an increase in the number of judges by 2 additional judges. And this is important for the way courts function. So each additional judge resolves 200 litigation or cases in the court, and that increases the rate of backlog resolution, which I call the disposal rate, which is the ratio of number of cases resolved in the numerator and the total backlog of litigation in the denominator. And you see like a sustained increase over time. And what this means for economic outcomes, like first, I find among the firms located in that particular district as a jurisdiction of court, there's a sharp increase in their working capital because I use these balance sheet data, which reports working capital and key indicators more consistently than other indicators. So there's a sharp increase in the working capital, which shows that they're able to finance their operating expenses. And then there's also a decrease in the interest expenditure. So all the kind of dues that they owe to their creditors, including banks and so on. And so when I look at, okay, what's happening at the credit market level, overall, at the district level, I see a gradual increase in the number of loans given out to industrial borrowers over time. And so therefore, what does this mean for welfare? I see an increase in firm profit over time. And of course, this sharp increase in the profit relative to wages means that some of these profit increases also due to accounting measures. Like I said, there's an decrease in interest expenditure. And so some of those decrease in expenditure also lend to increase in profit. And because these are, as I mentioned, tax-paying units, if I compute a simple cost to benefit ratio, like how much does it cost for adding those two judges relative to the tax that can be generated from this economic activity, I find on average it's like the return is 5 times. And even if I take a very conservative estimate, the return suggests at least like the meeting of costs and earn much larger than meeting of costs. So that's because there's a lightning round. Like this is the key summary of the paper. I would like to just open up for discussion around this. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure if we're supposed to raise hands or something. Sorry, but
yeah, no, just raise your hand, or if it's quiet, just ask your question.
All right, maybe I can start.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, just one question I had is how to think about the kind of the dynamics of the effects. So I would expect that. And my strong prior would be that the big welfare effects of kind of better courts is kind of very long run, right? Like, yeah, firms today, they know that courts are working well, so they might increase their size kind of much bigger because they think in 15 years they can rely on the courts, right? But I feel like a lot of the experimental variation you have is rather short term, right? Like it's
exactly.
For a short while, there's an additional judge, and that kind of increases that court's efficiency, or like, right. So I'm wondering kind of how much this. I mean, I really like the identification strategy, but I'm just wondering how much of kind of the welfare effects you find are kind of really like a short run lower bound of.
Yeah. So the key important, yes, of course, like these are like these are not large scale reforms in the institutions, right? These are just showing like how capacity variations can generate these welfare effects, right? So the channel that I'm saying that is the liquidity effects, right? So you have particularly think about bank lending, and you think about large firms, small borrowers, all kinds of borrowers, and they have borrowed heavily from banks. And banking in India is currently under huge amount of crisis. They're going through restructuring and so on. But one of the problems that led to banking crisis in India is the fact that people were not returning the capital borrowed, right? They thought that like somehow most of these are public sector banks, and I can just talk to my politician, they'll just write off the loan and so on and so forth. And of course, going to the courts mean that it's just like lack of resolution for years and so on. And so what's the point? So what I show is that like, yes, I mean, there is a point in the sense of the courts had more judges, so if there's a backlog of cases now, that gets resolved. So let's say on the margin, like 10 more debt recovery litigation resolved, and these are somewhat modest size debts. So these are not like hugely large, but you think about like small firms, let's say they've borrowed for running an electric generator to sort of tide over power cuts and so on, and let's say it's about $10,000, right? So like that gets resolved, and so the judge orders that like, look, either you return this $10,000 or your generator that you purchased from the store will be confiscated and like liquidated and so on. So the bank then is able to recover this money, and they have this additional liquidity to lend, and which is why I show that there is an immediate increase in working capital. Like why would suddenly like firms like have a sudden shock in their working capital, or like a lower interest burden? And so that sort of leads to, and then even if you look at, I mean, these are modestly long run, like even these small short-term perturbations in the staffing capacity, because I do bin these endpoints. So of course, I mean, my data window is from 2010 to 2018, and there are multiple events that are happening, which I account for. But if you know that like these are creating an effect over at least 4 to 5 years, these are at least a moderate time scale for like firms to kind of think about operating expansions rather than, investing in another plant, for example. Thank you. That's a very important question. Michael had a question.
Yes. So if I understood correctly, you just look at the number of judges, and therefore you kind of treat them somehow as if one is equal to the other, right? So I was wondering, one, if you are able to say something about the quality skills of different judges, perhaps the ones that move are better or worse of the others. So there could be, beyond the numeric effect, there could be an effect of that that explains your effects. And the second one is whether you can say something about the the type of the quality of the sentencing, and whether that improves as well, whether it's not just about speed of sentencing, but also about the quality.
So to answer the first question, yes, I do only see numeric changes because I have like the counts. I mean, I can see the disaggregated data shows whether there was a judge in that particular courtroom in a year where a particular litigation was being heard, but I don't have the detailed characteristic of the judge to kind of figure out if the incoming judge was better in education levels or past sentencing and so on than the one who's leaving. So I mean, I only have numeric effects on the judicial capacity rather than like in these other dimensions on quality. But then I'm only looking at within a district court over time, and because these rotations are based on these there are a lot of constraints that I describe in the paper about like how judges have short tenure and they can't repeat a court where they've been in past, and so these rotations and generates, I mean, I wouldn't go to claim that as good as a random assignment of judges, but quite ad hoc, I would say, of these judges. So to some extent, the quality should not be that correlated with the characteristics of the district, but I'm not going to put like too much weight on that, but I am only focused on the numeric, like quantity of the number of judges. So the other question you said was on sentencing, quality of sentencing rather than just speed. Again, this paper is just focused on like the simplest outcome, which is the speed, and from the perspective of debt recovery, like the sentencing quality. I've looked at a fraction of random subsample of debt litigations, and most of them are like pretty straightforward. So the quality of sentencing is quite uniform. It's just the court orders the borrower to repay within a time frame, or what to do if they don't if they don't repay with the kind of collateral with the bank and so on. So it's pretty straightforward. In more than 80% of the cases, the sentence is in favor of the bank to kind of go ahead and recover the loan. And so for that this channel that I focus on, like the sentencing doesn't really matter, but I would imagine for other things like incarceration and criminal justice outcomes, like that should matter a lot. But yeah, thank you.
I heard we have 5 minutes left, so if any other of you have another question, please go ahead.
I have a question. Hi. So one thing I was wondering is this: you use this district level variation, right? So how common is this for banks to lend within the district? But there are also spillovers, I guess, right? So how do you account for?
Yeah, in this context, it's completely, I mean, I'm sure like even in the context in other countries like the US, for example, a lot of the lending happens through local branches of banks, right? So like, for example, here, I'm in San Diego. If I need a loan, I go to my Bank of America branch in UC San Diego. And I mean, that's how I would do, but that's not to say that that's the rule. But like I know I've spoken to some of the bank managers and legal counsels in India, and they say that like, what happens for banking for the corporate sector, at least for the firms, is that the local branches and the managers and officers go to the corporate headquarters, and which is why I match the firms with their corporate headquarters with the jurisdiction of the court, and these banking representatives from the local branch go to the particular court to ask if they to the particular firm if the firm wants to borrow and so on, to kind of check, okay, here's where the registered office is, and how many employees do they have and so on, do they have some kind of repayment capacity and so on. So they do make that kind of assessment before giving out the loan. And so yeah, the lending is quite local, and the public sector banks also kind of set district-wise targets and so on. So yeah, so cross-district borrowing is like very, very minimal, or it doesn't happen because of the rules.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Prabhat?
Yeah, so Yeah, a very nice paper, Manaswini. I have one question, which is, I think, not related to what you have shown, but in a constrained, legal capacity environment, it is more likely that collusion between judges and these firms may take place, right? Especially in Indian setting, it is not unheard of. So, do you think it would be plausible for you to see that, either not using probably this data, but maybe some other data? Have you thought about that? I'm sure you thought about that, but yeah, can you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, like these kind of like collusion or corruption. So, I mean, these are hard to measure. So one thing that I'm looking at, so the results here are, even if I look at the subset of non-litigating firms, right? So like those that don't have any ongoing litigation in the period. So therefore, I can account for like, oh, our firms bribing. The kind of firms that benefit from the litigation are banks, which are on the petitioner or the plaintiff side. Now, it could be that the collective of, I mean, like I said, like the sentencing in the case of debt recovery is quite simple, right? Like, okay, the contract is quite clear. The bank has lent out to a borrower, and they have proof to show that, and the sentence is always in favor of bank. So I wouldn't call that collusion, because the banks have no other, I mean, they can send like collection agents and so on, but that's the legal recourse before they can liquidate the collateral, right? So they have to show, and they have to show a court order to do any kind of liquidation. So those are the kinds of the litigation that I'm focusing on, that kind of, now, like I said, the capital stuck under litigation. I wouldn't want to call it misallocation, but to some extent it is that, right? Like you do have a lot of these capital that were lent out, and it's with those guys, and they're not, the returns on the economic activity is negative or whatever, because they're not repaying, right? And then so you can as well give that a loan to another firm that could generate positive return. And so that's what has happened basically. So, well, they say thank you for your questions. The breakout room is closing in 8 seconds. I appreciate. Thank you so much.
Everyone. Thank you.